It's the ultimate defining argument against the electric future. It's the specter of a national emergency, the image of cascading failure that keeps utility executives up at night and fuels the most passionate political debates about energy policy. As millions trade their gas pumps for charging ports, the fear is simple, terrifying, and widely publicized. Will electric vehicles overload and collapse the U.S. power grid? The idea is terrifying, but it is overwhelmingly based on flawed math and outdated assumptions about how electricity is used, and more importantly, when it is needed. The mathematics of the opposition certainly sound frightening. If 200 million cars across the country suddenly switch from liquid fuel to electrical energy, that's a massive, unprecedented demand. Experts often toss around figures that suggest a full conversion to EVs could increase national power demand by 25% or more. The logic is simple. If you suddenly add a quarter more load to a system that already struggles during peak summer heat, the whole thing goes dark. Lights go out, hospitals fail, the grid crumbles. But this fear is based on one colossal foundational misunderstanding: that everyone will charge their car the way they currently fuel their gas tank, all at once during peak hours and without regard for cost or time. The reality of EV charging is dictated by the power demand curve, and this is where the grid's supposed enemy becomes its biggest ally. The United States power grid already has massive amounts of spare capacity, specifically during the valley of demand. This valley occurs overnight, typically between midnight and 6 a.m., when most industries are offline and most residential use is limited to refrigeration and essential electronics. This capacity is already being generated by baseload power plants that cannot be easily cycled off, meaning that energy is often being generated but effectively wasted. Unlike filling a gas tank, which requires 5 minutes of full power draw, an EV doesn't need to charge in 5 minutes. It can happily charge for 8 hours while you sleep. This is fundamentally a behavioral shift that the grid can easily manage. Unlike the gas station model where you queue up to pay for fuel in a hurry, studies show that roughly 80% of EV charging happens at home or at work. This means the car is sitting idle for long periods. When you arrive home at 6 p.m., your vehicle sits parked until you leave again at 6 a.m. The EV driver has the luxury and the economic incentive of choosing when to pull the energy. This is precisely the choice that allows the grid to manage the incoming load effectively through smart infrastructure and pricing. This economic incentive, managed by utility companies, is the grid's greatest tool: the time of use rate. The utility company's secret weapon is turning the customer into a load balancer. By making electricity dramatically cheaper overnight, often a 50% or greater discount, they create a powerful, irresistible economic signal. Your car's computer automatically schedules its charging session for 1 a.m. when the grid is actively begging to offload excess power. This active load management strategy naturally shifts the new, enormous EV load away from the dangerous evening peak and into the low-demand valley. This effectively smooths out the peaks and fills the valleys, which is the exact opposite of a collapse scenario. It makes the grid more efficient. However, we must concede that the fear of grid stress is not entirely unfounded, but the true threat is highly localized. The national high-voltage transmission lines are generally designed with ample headroom. The real problem is the highly localized infrastructure, often referred to as the last mile of distribution. Think of the local transformer mounted on a pole or resting in a pad mount box on your street. Many of these local transformers, installed in the 1970s and 80s, were never designed to handle the simultaneous demand of modern high-load appliances like central air conditioning, home solar systems, and now multiple Level 2 EV chargers. If 5 houses on that single transformer all plug in and start pulling 40 amps each at the same moment, even at 2 a.m., that transformer will overheat, trip its fuse, and ultimately fail. Upgrading this local infrastructure, the final wires, the meters, and especially the distribution transformers, is the single biggest, most expensive, and most time-consuming challenge facing the energy transition. Utilities across the country are facing the prospect of spending billions in necessary localized upgrades to handle these inevitable clusters of high-demand EV homes. This is not a national capacity issue. The electrons are being generated. It is a delivery bottleneck issue where the local pipes aren't big enough to get the water to the tap. But here, too, technology is solving the problem ahead of time. The solution is being embedded directly into the charging equipment itself. Smart chargers are now mandated in many states and by many utility programs. These devices don't operate in isolation. They can communicate with the utility in real time. If the utility's monitoring system detects that the local transformer is starting to reach its thermal limit, it can send a signal to the smart chargers in that area. The chargers then automatically reduce their pull from, say, 40 amps down to 10. The charging takes longer for the customer, perhaps 12 hours instead of 8, but the lights stay on for the entire neighborhood. This managed charging is crucial for the stability of the local distribution network. The final, most revolutionary concept completely flips the EVs are an enemy narrative on its head. EVs don't just take power, they are giant mobile batteries that can give it back. This is vehicle-to-grid and V2G technology, and it is the single most powerful future solution for grid stability. V2G allows every parked EV to act as a decentralized battery pack. Imagine millions of cars soaking up cheap, abundant solar power during the sunny midday hours when power is cheapest. And then, at the grid's moment of greatest need, the high-demand 6 p.m. evening peak, they can be programmed to sell a fraction of that stored energy back to the grid for a profit. This widespread distributed battery storage adds incredible resilience and flexibility to the system. Instead of relying on a few massive, fragile, centralized power plants, the grid gains access to a huge distributed network of power banks. If a centralized power plant suddenly trips offline, causing a major energy deficit, millions of V2G-enabled cars can immediately bridge the gap, preventing a local or regional blackout. EVs, coupled with the mandatory deployment of home battery storage like the Tesla Powerwall, fundamentally decentralize the source of power. The EV is not the failure that will crash the grid. It's the distributed storage solution and stabilization asset the grid desperately needs to manage the massive influx of intermittent renewable sources like wind and solar. So, will the U.S. power grid collapse? The evidence strongly suggests no, it will not collapse, but it will certainly evolve, and it faces enormous logistical and financial hurdles at the local distribution level. But by proactively utilizing established off-peak charging behavior, smart chargers that communicate with the utility, and the inevitable rise of vehicle-to-grid technology, the EV transition will ultimately prove to be the most powerful, necessary, and effective modernization force the grid has seen in a century.